Yo, yes, hei hå, hei. Yep, ja, ja.
Så sannheten er at vi er usikre. Ingen har sagt ifra. For du lurer på om du skal ha sånn lydlinje rett inn.
Jo, jeg har det, men altså hvis jeg skal Skype, altså, hva er tanken på den Skype-greia?
Så Skype-greia trenger ikke å streames, eller det vil si, den skal ikke streames.
Men er det meningen at de som Skyper skal ut på anlegget?
Skal
Ut på anlegget?
Ja, det blir
Ja.
presentasjonen er via Skype på en måte.
Ja. Vi har et lite logistikkproblem der for øvrig, fordi vi vet ikke hvordan vi skal få signalisert til henne når hun har 5 og 10 minutter igjen og sånn av innlegget sitt. Fordi vi må være litt strikte på tid, for jeg vet ikke om hun får noe videofeed fra oss. Det er vel kanskje ikke noe annet sted enn gjennom denne.
Noen må jo bare skrive til henne eller være her.
Jeg tror det. Men vi har tid til å snakke med henne før hun kommer på, så det burde gå fint, egentlig.
For 20 years, he made the dreams of young people come true with his hugely popular Jimmel fiction.
What do we want to do here?
Yeah, just close it. For some reason, this one has an unregistered office version, so it just has to be closed.
I can assure you that everything of mine is very
Oh, no.
registered
No,
on the computer.
it's not your presentation, it's the actual office program
Okay.
on the computer. Let's see. There we go. Sorry, yeah, so that's a slight
So
inconvenience,
just
but
like if it pops out, I will close
it's
it.
just every time you open PowerPoint, that will pop up. We just have to
Okay.
close it, then it won't pop
Okay.
up. Hello, Elizabeth.
Hello, how are you today?
How about you?
Great.
How did it go yesterday?
Very nice. You guys chose a wonderful restaurant. We really enjoyed it.
I'm talking about the interview.
They didn't call.
Are you serious?
Yeah, I'm serious. I stayed in the room. I told Philip Andre. I talked to Philip Andre. I told him I'll be in the room until 6:45. And
Sorry.
Really?
yeah,
Did you let him know that they didn't call?
I didn't.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
I forgot mine is her. Not very wise when you're doing revisions. Up until the final sentence. Yeah.
Angus will bring several just to.
Very clever of you. And not of me.
I put together a PowerPoint introduction.
Always not a hassle. Always, I put things in Dropbox. I try to email. Send it all over the place. That's like the worst nightmare.
Send a physical copy to your mother and your
With my will.
Ja. Så det er en mappe som heter Presentations her, så jeg bare legger den inn der. Skal vi se.
Det er den, der hedder MultiLing.
Den. Sånn.
Meget fint. Ja.
Veldig bra. Ok.
Skal vi se data midt? Ja. Hi, boss.
Hello. Hello, other boss.
Yeah. You're the boss for today.
Test, 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 test.
Can everyone hear me now? Super. Okay, welcome, welcome, welcome. It's fantastic to see everyone here today for this very special event that MultiLing, the Center of Multilingualism in Society Across the Lifespan, has organized and sponsored. Entitled Multilingualism, Forensic Linguistics and Law. And good morning to everyone. My name is Elizabeth Lanza and I'm the center director. Has anyone ever heard of MultiLing, Center for Multilingualism in Society Across the Lifespan? The people that work there, you're not allowed to raise your hands. Some people, we hope so, because as I'm going to point out, public dissemination of our results and work with major stakeholders is very important. And that's why this event today fits within that mandate that we have, that we would like to reach out to. I'm going to give you, the plan now is that I'm going to give you a short presentation of MultiLing, the center, to give you an idea of the work we do and how this particular work fits within our overall plan. And then from there, I'm going to turn over the mic to the brain behind this organization of this conference, Professor Annette Pavlenko. So let's go on. MultiLing is a center of excellence, which means that it's funded by the Research Council of Norway through a special funding scheme entitled the Center of Excellence Funding Scheme. And in 2013, we were one of the lucky ones that made it through after 2 years of applications. There were 13 new centers with a wide range of topics established, from cancer biomarkers and multilingualism to subsea gas reservoirs and mental disorders. What's really fantastic about the Center of Excellence funding is that it allows researchers to envisage research projects over a long period of time. It gives long-term financing, and it allows us to develop the fields that we find important for addressing our goals. So then our goals, the first one, the major one, is research-based knowledge on multilingualism in the individual and in society with the lifespan perspective. And we aim to be at the international research forefront. We remind ourselves sometimes, we say we want to go beyond the international research forefront. Societal relevance is very, very important, and the type of work that's going to be presented today fits very well within this agenda to contribute knowledge to policymakers and other stakeholders. And last but not least, high-quality research training, because we are responsible for the next generation of researchers in the field of multilingualism. So we support research training and ensure that high quality is part of it, and international collaboration. Beyond our goals, we have a vision. A vision is a bit more abstract, and we would like to contribute to how society can deal with the challenges of multilingualism through increased knowledge, promoting agency for individuals in society, and a better quality of life no matter what linguistic and social background. What's innovative about us? What we do is that we have a quite interdisciplinary team of researchers. I'll come back to that. And our two main sort of innovative aspects is that what we originally said, we want to bridge the gap. That means we'd like to bring together disciplines that usually don't work together, to try to get them together to solve problems, issues related to multilingualism. And at the same time, we address the lifespan perspective. So we have research on babies all the way to the elderly. Our research is organized like this to give you an idea. It goes from the individual in theme 1 to society in theme 3. Theme 1 addresses multilingual competence, the linguistic competence of the individual. Multilingual practices is theme 2, the theme of theme 2. When individuals get together, how do they use their linguistic resources in communication? And then theme 3, the management of multilingualism across the lifespan. And there we look at such aspects of as language policy, language ideologies, what address or what affects the societal aspects of multilingualism. Now, this is starting to be a dated picture, but to give you an idea, Every year we have an annual meeting of the Scientific Advisory Board, our International Scientific Advisory Board, and we're having one tomorrow and Friday, so we'll be getting a new picture. But in any case, this is an older picture, and we have about 38 researchers, senior researchers who have positions in Oslo, and also doctoral and postdoctoral candidates. And if you're interested, and I hope you are interested, we have lots of exciting research projects around these 3 different themes. You can go onto our website and you can see, find more information about these projects and also who's working on the projects. I'd like to highlight 2 of our so-called flagship projects. And we call them flagship because they have been honored by also getting external funding. The first one is Multifam, looking at family language policy in multilingual transcultural families. Many, many transcultural, transnational families today through modern day globalization. And the MultiLing Dementia Project, language and communication in multilingual speakers with dementia in Norway. As we know, even within the European framework, that the aging society is an extremely important topic of research, and we're addressing this specifically through work with multilingual speakers in dementia. And we're lucky to have our project leader here. You can raise your hand if anyone's interested about hearing more about the project. Also, MultiLing had the honor of being chosen to be one of the 5 research environments at the University of Oslo to receive what's been labeled world-leading status funding. And this was special money appropriated by the Norwegian Storting to the universities. And then the universities had a competitive process for choosing those who would be selected. And we were selected. And this allowed us to hire 3 highly profiled researchers, each within their field, and also doctoral and postdoctoral positions. So there you see a specification from theme 1 with multilingual aphasia. And then we have theme 2 addressing multilingualism and mediated communication, and theme 3, multilingualism and globalization, perspectives from Norway. So we have a lot going on, and this particular funding has also given us money to establish a socio-cognitive laboratory, and we're now in the process of building up that laboratory. And a lot of the type of research in forensic linguistics that's relevant will be able to be done in this new laboratory once it's up and going. We also have another new professor whom you will be meeting shortly after me, Professor Annette Pavlenko from the US, her specialty in the bilingual mind and also an expert in forensic linguistics. I'm not going to steal her thunder right now, but I'll say a few words about her just before she takes the stage. So I mentioned that research training is vital for us, very important, thinking of the next generation. We have winter schools, summer schools, and we open it up actually to everyone who wants to attend. It's free of charge. We also have international partnership. It's extra funding we have that supports mobility and networking and research training specifically with 4 top universities in South Africa. So we've used this funding to bring South African students to Norway to interact and interchange with our students on issues of multilingualism, which is very, very exciting because, you know, South Africa is a highly multilingual society. Just a picture of the happy group at the course. Dissemination and outreach, as I mentioned, reaching out, societal relevance is very important for us. Has anyone been to the Språkutstilling, the language exhibition? Okay, MultiLing people are not allowed to raise their hands. No one? Some people? I really urge you to go there. It's been open now for a year, and it's going to remain open to the end of this year. It's at the Oslo City Museum in Frognerparken. And here you can see some pictures inside. It's called Oslo sier, språk I byen, and Oslo says, language in the city. And we have in the far left there on the bottom, you can see from the opening where we had the president of the Storting open the exhibition, and we have the former rector of the University of Oslo. It was very interesting because they started doing these dialect battles, and I don't know who won. They were fighting over who won, I think. Okay, another very important aspect of outreach that we have, there was a documentary on the Kven language. Has anyone seen it on NRK? It was a film entitled The Secret Language, Det hemlige språket, and it was produced by Light Source Publications in collaboration with MultiLing's Pia Lane, so professor at at the university with us, and the Text Laboratory. The film addresses questions such as, if your language is not recognized as a language, how does this affect you? Really tapping on the emotional aspects of reclaiming a heritage language. NRK, the national broadcasting company, bought up the rights for it. It's been aired many times, and it's still available online until March 2018. So you can check online if you'd like to see this, this film. So we have, as I said, international collaboration. We have collaboration with important partners here in Norway, Statped, Fafo, Språkrådet, University of Tromsø, as well as international partners across the world. This is just a few that we actually have binding contracts with. Otherwise, we have a very, very strong and extensive network. And new collaborations we're establishing, or we have established, with the only Australian Center of Excellence in Language, and there's with Singapore as well. So, have a great conference. And before I leave here, I'm just going to say a few words about Anette Pavlenko. It's good that you're standing there. Many of you perhaps know her, I'm sure you know of her if you've read some in the field, but I'm going to call you Anette right now. Anette is a Ukrainian-American linguist specializing in the study of bilingualism, particularly the relationship between bilingualism and cognition and emotion. She's written numerous articles and books about bilingualism and about multilingualism. Just visit her personal webpage. I tease her sometimes and I say she spits out a book a year, you know. She was president of the American Association for Applied Linguistics from 2014 to 2015, and she won the very prestigious TESOL Award for Distinguished Research in 2009. TESOL is the Teaching of English to Speakers of Other Languages, and this is an international organization. And she also won the British Association for Applied Linguistics Best Book of the Year Award in 2006 for her book, Emotions and Multilingualism. In 2015, she published the book, The Bilingual Mind. All of these books really have become important works in the field. Anette frequently blogs about bilingualism at psychologytoday.com. It's a blog that's really very exciting. I suggest to get on that list if you aren't already. It was initiated by François Grosjean, who is an important psycholinguist, Nestor in the field of bilingualism. Anette Pavlenko was until recently in the education department of Temple University in the US, and now we're proud to say that Anette Pavlenko is ours. She's a research professor, Professor 2 at MultiLing. And at MultiLing, she'll focus on communication in legal cases where refugees and immigrants are involved. She's an expert in the field of forensic linguistics, and it's thanks to Anette that this event is taking place now. So today we're thrilled to launch this field of research, forensic linguistics, at MultiLing through this conference that brings together local and international experts in the field, thanks to the inspiration and efforts of Anette Pavlenko. So please join me in welcoming Anette Pavlenko.
Thank you very much, Liz. Thank you, everybody, for this warm welcome and a great introduction. Let me begin by telling you why I came to Norway and why Norway is a perfect place for having this gathering. I said so to many of my colleagues. Norway is just very linguistically tolerant. It's a famous place in Europe for its linguistic tolerance. And then one of my colleagues was arriving yesterday, and she sent me this wonderful picture that she took from her plane. I don't know if you can see very well what it says. It's Ivar Alsen, a Norwegian linguist. In no other country in the world we have linguists profiled on airplanes, right? I know I'm in the right place when I come to Norway. So, Liz, you should be next, right? That's my hope. And I also wanted to say a few words about what forensic linguistics is. I am not going to ask you whether you know what forensic linguistics is, because I'm assuming that all of you have an idea. But in the larger scheme of things, forensic linguistics is really about the intersection between language and law, except that lawyers oftentimes think that they know all there is to know about language, and linguists, of course, think they know everything there is to know about language and maybe law. But nobody has a full, complete picture. So I think it's good to have gatherings like this where we bring together lawyers and judges and court interpreters and linguists to talk to each other about our respective pieces of that puzzle. So what forensic linguistics is from a linguistic perspective, it's a study of applications of linguistic knowledge, methods, and insights to the context of law. And it is a field now, it is a real field. It has its own association, an International Association of Forensic Linguistics. It has its own journal. It has its own conferences. And what is it that forensic linguists do? They analyze recordings sometimes to identify maybe speaker voice or say, well, that's not the same speaker. They do linguistic profiling, telling the investigators a little bit more about a particular speaker. They may be asked to analyze speech acts. Was there bribery? Was there coercion? Was there a false confession? They may analyze written evidence. Who is the author? Was there plagiarism? Is there a trademark infringement? And the expert witness would then appear in court. They would examine linguistic evidence. They would write a report stating one's professional opinion. Our professional opinion, who asks for it, also varies. In Germany, it's the judge you report to. In the US, you appear on the team of the prosecution or the defense, but you are still really responsible to the judge. You are not responsible for the story your side is trying to tell. You participate in a deposition, and then you testify in court to the best of your professional opinion. And in cartoons, it looks something like this. The subject grew up in Amsterdam, has lived in New Orleans with the exception of a few years in Toronto. I can assure you we cannot do that, but we can do a lot of other things. What we can do is make connections between the fields of multilingualism and forensic linguistics. And that connection has sometimes been made in problematic ways in cases of linguistic profiling with asylum seekers. So forensic linguists are people who study the misapplications and misuses of linguistic theory in these cases and try to make sure the procedures are becoming better. We study courtroom interaction in a second language to determine what goes on, court interpreting and translation. Other cases where errors in court interpreting may lead to misunderstanding, to problems. Comprehension in a second language, and that is the area of my own research, police interviews. Are things said by the policeman actually understood as intended? Most importantly, and I would say that's my broader agenda, and that's where it intersects with the issue of human rights, we study something called language access policies. Do people have access to the language they need in law enforcement? And the reason for that, if you look at that very disturbing statistic that came out in January 2016 on countries that imprison most foreigners. United Arab Emirates is in the lead, but if you look closely at the list, it has several European countries, including Switzerland, Monaco, Luxembourg, Greece, Liechtenstein, Cyprus, Austria, Belgium, and Estonia, Malta. Yes, some of the smaller countries may have only 4 prisoners, 2 of them foreigners, but in bigger countries, it's an issue that foreign population is overrepresented in the prison population, in the court system. And the question then becomes, do they always have access to the language they need to make sure that we observe their rights to due process, because everybody should have the same right to due process. And when we look at the language access, what we see is that interactions with law enforcement, police interviews, interpreting is oftentimes ad hoc. Some police members know how to call for an interpreter, where to look for one, but not every country, not every legislation ensures that people have access to interpreters. In the courtroom, most countries have standardized policies. Some still do not. In correctional facilities is where we run into trouble, because correctional facilities are not equipped in interpreting. So if you go to jail in a country whose language you don't know, you're really at the mercy of people who may speak your native language. So the larger question for us is to establish what are the language policies and language access policies in different countries. Can we exchange information on what the best practices are? And this is part of the purpose for today's conference. So you will hear today from many of my colleagues from different parts of the world on how language is used as evidence in national and international jurisdictions. You will hear about different practices in court interpreting in Norway and outside of Norway. You will hear about police interviewing. And once again, we urge you to please ask questions, raise issues. There will be time set apart specifically for debate and discussion, because it's really important for us that we have a dialogue. The reason I came to Norway and I joined the Center for Multilingualism is two-part. Yes, I would love to help train the new generation of forensic linguists in Norway. Norway already has one, Marit Riis Johansen, who will be appearing here. And that training would not have any point or any sense if we also didn't have the need for linguists from the larger society. So one of the purposes of today's conference is to convince everybody that sometimes you need a linguist. Thank you. So, right on the dot, I am delighted to introduce our plenary speaker, Tanja Christensen from Denmark. She flew in today from Copenhagen to tell about the exciting work she does, and she works frequently with Danish police. And she can tell you more about the practices in Denmark.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here. This looks like such an interesting event, and I'm really happy to be interacting with everybody here. So I hope we will have time to discuss quite a lot during the day, and also at the end. I should have time for questions at the end of my presentation here today. So an overview of what I'm going to talk about is I will try to, first of all, widen the perspective a little bit, frame the case that I'm going to talk to you about a little bit by employing some terms from neighboring disciplines, what's called international relations studies. So this is a socio-political type of study. That's also attracted some interest within social linguistics recently. It's called securitization, and I'm going to look into that in just a few seconds. And then I'll talk a little bit about the objectives and consequences of counterterrorism legislation. The case is Denmark here. And then I'll go on to the specific case where I testified, which has to do with the Danish so-called foreign fighter, and I'll define that also shortly. The data for that case are a series of chat messages, and I'm going to show you examples from them so that I can illustrate the type of analysis that I do, and that I submitted in the form of a report at the end of this case. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about also what happened at court during the very high-profile court trial that took place last year in this matter. And then at the end, I'm going to again try to widen the perspective a little bit and look at how the securitization perspective informs the type of data that we're dealing with here. Yes. So securitization, this is actually a new concept for me, and a good colleague from Copenhagen advised me to look into that. It stems from what's called international relations studies. It has to do with how typically governments or states frame an issue in society in terms of the need for more security. And it is one of the issues that they deal with is how an issue that is first politicized, as it's called, is then framed as an existential threat. That's really important. And an existential threat to either the state or an institution or a smaller group or even an ideology or the economical system, something at a really high level is faced with some sort of threat. And what goes on then is actually a linguistic maneuver, and this is why it's interesting from a forensic linguistic perspective or a social linguistic perspective as well. The theory states that a securitizing actor, and this will often be a government agency or the government itself, will assert the need for extraordinary measures to protect the insecure state or institution or whatever it is. So they will say, they will perform a speech act that says, we are in danger. There is an existential threat posed against us. So here's a quote from them, from one of the, fairly recent introductory books on this issue. It says, a securitizing actor uses language to articulate a problem in security terms and to persuade a relevant audience of its immediate danger. The articulation in security terms conditions the audience and provides securitizing actors with the right to mobilize state power and move beyond traditional rules. Yes. So what I'm dealing with here is a case of terrorism or counterterrorism. So let's look a little bit into how this pans out when we are looking at security and securitization. So one of the things we can ask is the security issue, for who and from whom does it matter? So the issue that has been brought up in securitization studies is mainly that the state needs to be protected, in this case, for instance, from terrorists. So that's when the whole securitization model begins. But you could also see it from another perspective, and this has been raised in this type of study as well, that citizens, when the whole securitization model begins, can be subjected to different types of oppression from the state. Their civil rights may be in danger in different ways, so that, for instance, their liberty or their freedom of speech and their freedom of movement is curtailed in different ways from the state. So, counterterrorism legislation is something that we see a lot in modern society, especially in many Western societies that feel the need to securitize themselves. So here I'm going to look first at the objectives of such counterterrorism legislation. And this is built on how it looks from a Danish perspective. So in February 2015, this is quite recently, Danish Parliament passed a series of law regulations restricting freedom of movement for suspected foreign fighters. And foreign fighters are defined as private citizens of other nationalities that are involved in armed conflict in Syria or Iraq. So quite specific, actually. And it's often mentioned in different reports that terrorist organizations such as ISIS have attracted approximately 3,000, at this point that was in 2014, foreign fighters from Western Europe that come down from different countries and take part in the conflict. The primary concern related to this issue is not necessarily so much that they partake in the conflict, that they may enter into war and war zones, but that they might return to their home countries with battle skills and perform what's sometimes called single-cell terrorist attacks. attacks. So that's the political concern. So the new legislation that was passed in 2015 allows authorities to revoke citizens' passports and ban travel outside of Denmark for a limited period of time when, as it says in the bill, there is reason to assume that the person will participate in activities abroad that may cause or increase a danger to national security. So again, look at this from the perspective of securitization. This is mentioned specifically in the law that we have to protect national security, and we can then stop people from leaving the country by revoking their passport or even banning them from travel. So this is from the bill proposal text, and there's a translation here. And it's interesting to look at the bill proposal rather than the bill itself, because the bill itself is fairly short and specific and convoluted, as we know bills typically are. But the bill proposal is what is laid forth in Danish Parliament when they want to propose a new bill and discuss it. And so there are a little bit more argumentation to be found when we look at the bill proposal. Again, look at it from the perspective of securitization. So it says, the conflict in Syria and Iraq currently constitutes the most serious factor in the terror threat against Denmark. People leaving Denmark for Syria and Iraq to partake in fighting are now predominantly joining the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, ISIL, where they, among other things, achieve specific military skills. At the same time, the tough circumstances in the area of conflict can contribute to severe radicalization, brutalization, and predisposition for violence in the migrant. Collectively, this entails that the people concerned upon return to Denmark may have an increased will and capability to commit a terrorist attack. This is a threat to be taken seriously. And then at the end it says, with this bill, authorities are provided with new tools to handle the threat posed by people traveling abroad to take part in the conflict. These are new tools which clarify that foreign fighters partaking in religious war are fiercely opposed. The passive that you find here at the end, are fiercely opposed, is found in the original as well, and actually makes it fairly unclear who it is that opposes it, but it must be the government or the government agency that has proposed this bill. But it's also a political statement that's very important in the current situation in Denmark, and I think it's fairly similar here in Norway. That political parties want to profile themselves as someone who take very good care of the situation and the threat, apparent threat from returnees, as they're called. Okay, I'm going to now show you that it's actually not only language which is used in this securitizing effort. This is, I'm showing you now a few excerpts from a recent report by the Danish Defense Intelligence Service. This is a risk assessment. They publish it each year, and this is actually then later than the bill itself. This is the most recent one from 2016. It looks like this. And I want you to pause a little bit and reflect on how aesthetically pleasing it is to look at. This is a report that is submitted to the public. It's online on their website, and everybody can see it. And as you can see, there are large images. It is well designed. The images are also fairly easy to interpret. We see something that probably relates to cybercrime, and different types of conflicts, either abroad or, so to speak, at home. If you watch the Eiffel Tower there with now military personnel standing behind it or below it. This is just a short excerpt. I've taken this particular image because you can see that countries in the Middle Eastern region and Africa have been highlighted to show how some of the terrorist organizations that we know of have changed their distribution during the course of 2015 and 2016. And it is Al-Qaeda in the green type color and ISIS in the red type color. And a quick translation of some of the things that they mention here. They say at least 6,000 people from the West have traveled to the conflict in Syria and Iraq since 2012. The security-related challenge in the West will be greater for countries that have seen a large number of departing and returning battle-experienced ISIL extremists. That's what it says. So you notice that the number has risen quite substantially. It's at 3,000 in 2014. I have no idea whether these numbers are inflated or it's in fact true, or whether they have different sources to back this up. Here is now a short excerpt from the Sufan group, which is a group that looks into, for instance, risk assessment as well, and also deals a lot with foreign fighters and tries to gather numbers from different countries around the world. So one of the things they have been looking at is an estimate of how many foreign fighters come from several different countries in the world, and how many returnees, as they call it, do they have. So I'm going to highlight here Denmark, which is in focus for us now. The official count, and remember this is, these are small numbers because it's a small country. So there are only 125 in the official count of foreign fighters in Denmark. And Germany, for instance, has 760, as you see below, but Denmark is a much, much smaller country with just about 5 million inhabitants. And as you will see on the far right column here, the returnees are just about half of the ones that have left to fight in Syria and Iraq. And apparently that is a very high proportion, an unusually high proportion. So these are some of the issues that have been raised and have been drawn upon when the bill was proposed. Okay, so there are obviously also consequences to counterterrorism legislation, as I mentioned before. In the attempt to prevent terror or terrorist attacks, many also innocent citizens are surveilled and potentially even contained. But it's interesting to notice that not all citizens are equally subject to surveillance. So what we find is that so-called stereotypical terrorists are profiled. And they're profiled according to things like ethnicity, where did they come from originally, religion. It can be different types of communities of practice, and by that we mean who do you associate with, which groups of people do you hang out with in your spare time, for instance. So it could be whether you go to a mosque or something when it has to do with Islamic terrorists that we're talking about here. Such profiling constructs certain groups of citizens as dangerous to the rest of society. And that is to us, that notion of us that most societies have. What we also could call the normalized majority. This is a term from Didier Bigot that's mentioned here at the top as a reference. The normalized majority. And again, of course, that leads to an us-them dichotomy that we know of that's very frequent in the public discourse. And this can marginalize individuals who may then seek confirmation and acceptance by the very group that they may not previously have belonged to. So this is, of course, a pattern that we know of already, and can be one of the consequences also of counterterrorism legislation, as I mentioned. Okay, now let me go on to the case that I have consulted on and given testimony in. This is one of the few international headlines I was able to find. Otherwise, they're all in Danish. It has been a very high-profile case. It was the first to be tested in court, so it was an important case in many respects also because when the new bill has been passed, it has to be tested by the judicial system as well. What had happened previously to the case coming to court, many things had happened, but the one thing that involved me was that I got a request from Danish police in June 2015 and was told fairly little. Just about what you can find here on this slide is what I was told. I was told that it was a case regarding what we call in Denmark a Syrian warrior, so that's the sort of our local term for foreign fighters. When we take our perspective, we say, okay, it's someone going to Syria, so we call them a Syrian warrior. The data in the case were 192 written Skype instant messages between two people that I'm just going to call A and B here. And the Skype messages took place between the 6th and the 16th of March in 2015. So not a long time prior to the request I got. So this is fairly quickly after that. I was also given access to translation of some Arabic terms that were in there. There were some sort of formulaic phrases, quite a few of them in there. Some of them I checked myself, and others I just took offhand as, yes, they're good translations. And then I was given in a separate document a preliminary analysis and some minimal background information from the Danish police. The assignment that I got was quite vague. It was just, can you interpret the data for us? And this is going to be important. I'm going to return to that a little bit later. It means, though, that I had to consider very carefully what I was going to do. Oh, I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the data type first before I get into that. So Skype instant messaging, if you don't know, is a type of private chat. So it's not the type of chat where you have many people in one chat forum and you can see what everybody does. It's more like text messages, but just within Skype. So in principle, the communication is synchronous, but the synchronicity is dependent on the participation by both actors. So while it is the case that you can write back and forth very quickly, sometimes one party will have left for a while or is not present when they believe they should be messaging each other. And in distinction to the regular old-fashioned chat rooms, instant messages are saved under your user login details, so you can actually access them later. And this turned out to be important because the defendant in this case was not surveilled electronically at the time, but was apprehended, and his phone was apprehended as well, and through that they got access to all of those messages that then later were sent to me. Okay, when I began my analysis, I first of all, I'm going to talk to you about that a little bit later, but what I was pondering was, whatever do they want me to focus on? In 192 messages, they're short, yes, but it's quite a lot of information in there, and I have absolutely no idea what they might be more interested in. I guessed that they might be interested in the defendant's intentions. I had already heard about this new legislation, so I knew that it was an issue whether people intended to go to war in Syria or Iraq. So I thought that might be one of the things that they would be interested in knowing about A in this case. And of course, people's intentions are not directly accessible to us, not to linguists either. But to some extent, they can be indirectly accessible through, for instance, such a thing as topic analysis. Roger Shah has talked about that at great length. And also what I will here be calling text linguistic and pragmatic analysis. I'm going to show you some illustrations of what that means. The whole point here is that we want to try to render implicit meaning explicit. So things that are under the surface, or sometimes we talk about things being between the lines. Those are the things that I want to focus on and try to make very explicit in this type of report. I did it in 2 steps because I was myself quite worried about what I might find in the police report and whether it might affect my interpretation of the data. So I wanted to look at the data on their own first. So that's what I did. So I did a preliminary analysis only based on the chat messages, and I submitted that to the police and sort of hoped that this might be something along the lines of what they were asking for, since they hadn't actually said anything. And they asked me, yes, can you sign it up and put a stamp on it and send it to us? But also have a look at our report, because some of the things that you ask about in there, they're actually answered in our report. Okay, I thought about that carefully, and then I decided to look at their report, but try to be as specific as possible in my report as to when I based my analysis only on linguistic evidence and when I also would supply information from the police report. Okay, so this is first of all a topic analysis. Since I can't show you the whole data set, I'm trying to give you now an impression of what they are talking about in those chat messages. I did not include such a topic analysis in the report. I thought it would be too opaque for them. But what I want to focus your attention to here is that more than half of the messages have to do with some aspect of travel arrangements. Interestingly, as you can see over here, I say some of it has to do with leaving or returning to a place. This place is never mentioned. So there is a notable, I'd say, absence of references to A's final destination. It is A who's planning a travel, but they never mention to where. This, of course, makes it impossible for me to say explicitly that he plans to go to Syria or Iraq. But it is notable that it's not there. I find it odd that when people plan a travel, that they would never mention either the country or the city or the currency or anything having to do with that destination. It's certainly not the way that I plan my travels, at least. Okay, now I'm going to try to illustrate the type of analysis that I have done. In this data set, we find that there are a lot of what's called pronouns and pronominal expressions. That means that it's you don't mention specifically an entity or a person that you're talking about, but you refer to them through pronouns. That is, you can say he or it or that or they, there, here, things like that. So that means that it's not very transparent always what it is that they're talking about. You have to look a little bit further and try to see if maybe you can find it somewhere else in the data set, or sometimes not, or sometimes, as was the case for some of it, on the basis of other contextual information. That would be in this case from the police report. But again, then you'll have to be very careful in what you draw upon. Is it mainly the police report or mainly the linguistic evidence? So I tried very carefully to base my interpretations on language alone. So if you see here, this is one of the very early exchanges. A says, "How are you, brother? Can you speak?" B says, "Yes, brother, I can." Aki, that means brother. The connection, it is bad. And then A says, "Aki, it was lost," and notice the time gap here from 8:40 to 9:14. And then A continues, "Let me just fix the paperwork here." So I'm going to show you what it is that I've highlighted in my report, for instance. One thing is, Aki, it was lost. The it will probably refer to the connection that they've just talked about. That was bad. We don't know for sure, though, because there's been such a major time gap. So we don't know exactly what has been going on here. It's reasonable to assume that they have been talking on the phone because they have just written, "Can you speak?" "Yes, I can." And then the connection is bad. Okay. So that's one of the things we can show. So even though we have an opaque pronoun like it, we can give some reasonable interpretation of it given the context. Then there's an expression like the paperwork. Linguistically, we usually say that when something is a definite term like the paperwork, there is some specific paperwork. When you introduce it into a discourse and you don't say, "I have some paperwork," but you say it is the paperwork, then you assume that the other party will know what it is. The other party, B, is supposed to be able to make out what paperwork it is that A is talking about. And as you can see, or I'm telling you because you can only see from turn 8 here, it has not been mentioned before, not in the chat messages at least. But again, assuming that they have been talking on the phone, it is reasonable that they could have been talking also about some paperwork that we don't know what is, at this stage at least. There's also another pronoun, says here, and I'm going to return to these locative pronouns that has to do with where something is taking place. So clearly A says, "Here at this location where I am at, I have some paperwork." I'm assuming that you know what paperwork it is. Okay. as I mentioned earlier, I believe that the police might have been interested in intentions, and one of the intentions could be to go somewhere. So that was one of the things I tried to establish. Does he have an intention to go anywhere? So we're going to look at a series of messages here. B says, just take care of your stuff in the meantime so you're ready. Oh, and I'll just have to notice or mention to you that if you notice spelling mistakes, it's on purpose. So this is translated from Danish into English, but I have been trying to convey the fact that we have features from second language acquisition of Danish in the Danish data. So the mistakes that are in there are on purpose to show you, give you an impression of what it might have looked like if it had been in English. And of course, there are many, many issues related to translating, and we'll get back to that later today. But this is just as an illustration. Okay, then A says, I'm on my way to a city in Denmark that he mentions to fetch papers. Might be the same paperwork that we talked about before. And then another nearby city in Denmark, their system doesn't work, which is apparently an explanation of why he has to go to the first city he mentioned. Then the B says, okay, brother, may Allah make it easy for you, inshallah. And A says, remember me in your prayers in dua. And he says, yes, salam alaikum, I'm going to my nephew's now. And then A continues, and this is one of the cases where this synchronicity sometimes skips a beat, so to speak. There comes something in between, but in fact we can best interpret what A is doing as a continuation of his turn in number 47, where he says, remember me in dua, then that I come without hindrance. That is my hope. I think those two are pretty good evidence that he is intending to go somewhere. So please pray for me that I will come without hindrance. Okay. It's very important in this type of analysis, I feel, to state what might seem obvious, even for a lay reader. Because I want to make sure all the time that I'm not overstating what we can say based on linguistic evidence, and also that we want to establish some sort of minimal level of facts in this case that can be based only on linguistic evidence. So some of these things will seem very, very basic, but this is just to establish that we can see some things out of the linguistic data alone, and that they can be important for the trial later on. Here I'm going to focus on the difference between here and there. So here in number 77, B says, and from here we give you recommendations, inshallah. Not think about anything, my brother. It means that he doesn't have to worry. A has been very concerned about returning and whether people might think bad of him because he's been away, apparently. And then A says, Amen, I just think if brothers from there see me again. And then he continues a little bit later. So here we have an here from B. So in B's perspective, the here, where he is of course nearby to him. That's what here signals. And conversely, from A's perspective, it is there. That means at a distance from him. So we can assume that they may be talking about the same location, which is far from A, but close to B. Very simple. Here's something that's a little less simple, and that turned up in court as well. I'm going to return to that. In number 129, A says, Aki, I couldn't bring more than 20. May Allah give barakat in it. That's blessings. So may he bless it even though I could only bring 20. And then he asks another question, did you speak to the brother? And B replies to the first utterance and says, it's more than enough, Aki. Okay, more than 20 and more than enough. We have this number 20. That is not very informative to us as readers. 20 what? Are you going to bring 20 people, 20 guns, 20 what? I assumed that it had to do with an amount of money, which can be supported to some degree by B's reply, it is more than enough. At least he says, it's enough. But then later we get a confirmation of that interpretation when A says, should I exchange all the money into euro here from Denmark? And then B replies, yes, or in Turkey you can do it. So we have now, when we combine these different messages, a pretty good explanation of what the 20 might be. They are probably an amount of money, and I'm going to return to what amount of money it might be, but I guess that you would not think, even if you don't know very much about Danish currency, that 20 kroner is enough to be called more than enough. A good explanation would be that it's rather 20,000 Danish kroner, but this is just an abbreviated version, and they are talking about thousands of kroner already, perhaps. So 20 might be 20,000. I am again assuming that 20 million is way too much. So I'm thinking the one good option is 20,000. And I put that in my report. Okay, interestingly, again, there is something about locations, and now we have a name of a location, Turkey. Note that B does not say here in Turkey. This might be I might be over-interpreting this, but I'm going to show you support for the notion that B might not be in Turkey himself. And again, we're going to take this step by step. Here we are at a situation in the conversation where they're talking about details related to A's travel towards his final destination. B says in the beginning here, there are always brothers there that can help. It is their job to bring people in. They don't do anything else. May Allah reward them for that. And then A says, it won't be like I come there and then I'm alone. And B says, no, brother, you'll get a number before you arrive. So again, we have a there, which states that for B, the brothers that can help, they are not at his location. He is not where A is supposed to go first, at least, because there are brothers that are there, not at my place. He also talks about bringing people in. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to bring them from there's now a location with the brothers, and there's a location where B is. Bringing them in could mean that they are bringing them over to the location where B is. I'm avoiding mentioning it all the time, of course, as you'll notice, because it's not in the data. It might also just bring them to where they are. So we don't actually know from just bringing it in, but it may not be the final destination, again, since B is not there. And A, again, then also, he is, of course, at a distance from the brothers. They're not in Denmark with him, so that's also at a distant location from him. So if we continue, then we can see other things that might suggest that B is not at the same place as the brothers, the helpful brothers that we just learned of. B at some point mentions or advises that A should buy himself a Turkish phone number when he is in Istanbul. Again, it's not here. There's no mention of it being nearby B. And then at the end of this exchange that we see here, A says, can't you stand by the border and wait for me? Again, we don't know this for a fact, but a possible explanation or a possible interpretation of this is that A is going to Turkey, and that the border that they're talking about is some Turkish border to another country, where A is hoping that B will be waiting for him. Yes, so that might be a neighboring country. We don't know which from this data. Okay, so this is a type of analysis tried step by step, very detailed, very low-key in a sense, to show what can we say just on the basis of language. This I'm basing now on the step I made afterwards when I started looking at the police report. So aside from the Arabic translations and a bit of extra background information, throughout the police report, they had put in the chat messages, and then in a right-hand column, they had put in their interpretation of what's going on in this turn. This message, what does it mean? And with added information based on their investigation into the case. These are, of course, many different types of investigation that have nothing to do with language, and therefore is not part of what I do, but of course part of what the police do. It might sometimes make them over-interpret their data, I'm going to argue. So look at this exchange, or these 3 turns from B. He says, this is fairly early, you can see number 14. "It's okay, Aki, but you shouldn't listen to all those who talk. Just come, brother," he says. In the police report it says, "This implies that they already know each other from previous occasions and that B is aware of A's plans." Again, it's important for them to establish intentions. I believe this is false. I believe this is a case of overinterpretation. So I said in my report that there are at least 4 points we can make regarding especially number 15. The connector "but" signals both topic continuation and opposition. So I am continuing on a subject that we've already been talking about, but I'm now opposing your view. I'm saying something else. The negation "not" signals that A is currently listening. You should not. The combination of should and not says, you're listening now, but you shouldn't. I don't want you to do that. The phrase "listen to" does not mean just hearing it with your ears, but heeding it. So what he's actually saying is you shouldn't care about what other people are saying. That's the implicature, that people talk about A in a negative way and it affects him, and B advises him not to be affected by it. So that's a totally different point, as you see, if you compare it with what the police said. They said they know each other and B is aware of his plans. I don't see that at all in the data at this stage, but I see a lot of other interesting information that we can extract, I think. Okay, so now we're going forward to what happened at court in the summer of 16. Prosecution at the beginning asked me, can you tell if they've known each other before they start Skyping? And since they'd never asked beforehand of anything, I hadn't focused on this issue. So I didn't know. And I was taken aback a little, and I didn't know. And I just said, well, I can't unless I do some further analysis. I've had time to do a little bit of that, so I'm going to show you what we might have brought to bear on this question. These are the very first messages in this long thread of messages that we have. And as you will see, the first several of them are just A's attempt of connecting with B over Skype. So the hello, I would like to add you as a contact on Skype is an automatic message when you try to add someone. And then he adds a greeting and adds brother as well. And you can see that going on for some days. So the 6th, the 7th, the 8th, and the 9th go on before on the 10th B finally answers. So some of the things that I suspect the police might have noticed or thought were important for them to think that they might have known each other for a long time is the use of brother, and also the greeting, how are you, brother? In Danish, that's a very ordinary greeting, at least in American English, but it's not common in Danish to introduce yourself with how are you. You do that mainly with people that you actually know and asks, how are you feeling? Are you okay? Something like that. So that might be an issue. We, of course, can't tell whether that means something for these two people. So some of the issues that I wanted to consider as well is, first of all, that we're dealing with a very short time span here in this data set. We only have 10 days. So things are progressing very fast for the people that are involved here. It is also very high-risk communication for the two participants. They probably know that they might be surveilled and that one of them might be stopped by the police. Also, it has possibly to do with actually, at some point, coming to a very dangerous zone in Syria. There, I mentioned it, possibly. There's a very quick escalation that I haven't shown you in the data to terms of affection. So not only brother, which are very basic within this type of community, but also things like I love you. They say that, I love you, brother, in the name of Allah, something like that. The initial messages present, I think, a great deal of new information. If they know each other well, I don't think this should be necessary. So here are some examples. For instance, A talks about the paperwork that we've already looked at and says he has trouble getting it because their system is down. And then B asks, whose system? What are you talking about? At some point also, B informs A that many before him have left and then returned. This is apparently also new information for A, or at least something that he needs to be reassured about. A also, at a couple of occasions, introduces what I fear called his brotherhood name. So they have, as you know from Twitter, for instance, you can have a Twitter handle. They have a name, a pseudonym that they use on Skype when they communicate. And it's a very Arabic-sounding name. There's also some presupposed information that point in the other direction. For instance, as we've talked about, A mentions the paperwork already in number 14. But, as I mentioned, they must have talked on the phone. So that's not necessarily indicative of them knowing each other well. That might be just because they're referring to something that they talked about. So all in all, I actually do not find any evidence of them having known each other for a long time in the data. Okay, I was also cross-examined, and the defense attorney immediately challenged my analysis on the basis of the fact that I had access to the police report. And he said that it might have contaminated me. So, for instance, in the cross, I'm not going to go into detail on how many questions he asked me, but one I think is interesting. He said, how do you know that the number is 20,000 Danish kroner? Did that information come from the police report? And that's a good question for him to ask, because it actually says so quite explicitly in the police report. This is an excerpt from the police report. And it says in English that they're talking about the 20, as you see here. And it says that this is with reference to his success in obtaining a loan of approximately 20,000 Danish kroner that he can bring to Syria. So a lot of contextual information in the police report. So if I had read that beforehand, I would probably have been quite sure that it was 20,000 Danish kroner. I had not been very specific regarding that in court, but I did mention when he asked me that I could go through the steps that I already talked to you about. It might be 20,000 rather than 20 million or just 20 kroner. It might be kroner rather than something else because he's going to exchange it into euro and on like that. Okay, now we're going to again widen the perspective a little bit and interpret the data under the lens of securitization issues. So one of the important researchers within, or scholars within that field, is Didier Bigot. And he has a very perhaps difficult to understand notions called the panopticon. So you may be aware of Foucault's notion of the panopticon, which states that we are all under constant surveillance from each other in society. We are always at a risk of being watched by everybody else. So that makes us behave well because we can be seen, we can be watched by everyone. What Bigot mentions is that under these current situations where we have securitization, it is not a panopticon, so it's not everyone who's surveilled. It's a panopticon where a certain group that is already societally excluded, or at least is becoming societally excluded by the very securitization process. They are banned and marginalized, excluded, and those are the ones that are under surveillance. I mentioned the profiling at the beginning. He says then, this panopticon produces a knowledge as well as statements on threats and on security that reinforce the belief in a capacity to decrypt even prior to the individual himself, what its trajectories, its itineraries will be. So even before the individual knows what he's going to do, society knows it for him, or the authorities know it for him. And again, I think we should pause and reflect on the legal bill here, which is vague, but has a lot of that in there. When there is reason to assume that the person will participate in activities abroad that may cause or increase a danger to national security, the security of other states, or a significant risk to public order. These all have to do with assuming that he has certain plans. So, under these circumstances, what can a forensic linguist do? I've tried to show you what I did, but I also want to advise that we, whenever we can, perform preliminary analysis without access to background info, since I believe it is actually true that it can bias our interpretation. That's very important. So if one can do it in 2 steps, as I was able to do in this case, I think that is an important thing to do. We can also be very specific, and I think that's one of the competences of linguists, that we can be very specific in how far our analysis can bring us. And we can delimit it, and we can say, okay, this far and no further. We can't go any further than this on the basis of the linguistic evidence alone. Then it's up to the courts to add and adduce other information, other contextual information, other investigation that was in the case. And also, we can try to actively resist schemas of guilt. Those schemas, this has been proven again and again, arise almost automatically as soon as a court case takes place. So it arises for the jury, and it can arise also for expert witnesses, that as soon as someone has been detained by the police and the police have determined that there is enough evidence to start a court trial, then there is that glimmer of guilt in the back of your mind where you think, there might be something to it. And we have to actively resist that, I think. So that's what a forensic linguist can do under those circumstances. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Tanya, for a wonderful talk. We're now open for questions.
Thank you. This was very, very interesting. I was wondering about the interpretation the police made that they had known each other from before and that you resisted. But in the example you gave, he says something like, there's a microphone coming. Yeah. And I might even turn it on.
I think it is turned on.
Yeah, okay, that's good. The example, yes, here you might have it. No, let's see. The example was don't listen to the people who talk. And then you said that presupposes that there are some people talking and that this person is already listening to them. So doesn't that give some indication that he knows something about him, or was that information that came up in the conversation itself?
What's important to me here is the fact that they clearly communicate through other means than Skype. So from some of the messages, we know that they talk on the phone. From other messages that I haven't shown you, we can see that they also communicate through Facebook. So for instance, at one point, B advises A to remove a picture of himself that's on Facebook. And at another point, he says that he's blocked from Facebook, but now we'll just return to talking here, meaning Skype. So I guess that they have a lot of other opportunities to get to know one another and get background information. And that we need to take account of that as well, I think, in our interpretation. Yeah.
Other questions, comments?
Did the defense have an expert witness
Yeah.
or a linguist for that part? You were calling by the police.
Yes.
Did the defense have a...
No,
did
the
it
system is not in Denmark adversarial as we have it in the US and the UK. So it is typically not the case that either side will have their own expert witness. I present to the court mainly. And it is the court that decides whether they even want to accept a testimony such as mine. So no, they didn't. But they had a very clever defense attorney who was really very careful in trying to pull apart my analysis. Yes.
Thank you.
There are some questions in the back.
Is this on? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. It was very interesting. And I'm curious about the process that the police follow. Because for me, it's quite funny that they will send you the report straight away because it's quite clear that it's going to bias you. So is it completely up to you to decide if you read it or not?
In this case, it was, yes. Okay. I wondered about the same thing, and it did come up, as you see, in the court. So actually, it was even before prosecution began their direct examination. He raised the issue of me possibly being biased by the report. And as you may know, I'm not allowed to say anything unless I'm asked. So I was sitting on my hands and not saying anything, and but I couldn't say anything at that point. So I was very happy that they allowed me to testify, so that when he finally got to cross-examine me and ask me about this, I could say, okay, I've actually done this in 2 steps, and I have forwarded this, the original report to the police. He then argued that he should have seen that report as well, and that's probably true, that he should have. And it doesn't say anything that contradicts the final report. So it would have been quite okay to have both of them in there, I think. But yes, in this case, it was up to me. And I think that sometimes things like this happen because even the legal professionals don't necessarily know how to deal with linguistic data and the dangers that are inherent in providing, in this case, too much information. So this, I think, is where we should also try to educate legal professionals on how to handle this. At least that's my opinion. I believe firmly that we should try to make our analyses in 2 steps so that we're not biased.
Thank you.
There was another question.
Hello, thank you very much. Most insightful. I had a question about the language used. Which language? Which is the original language of communication? And also, when you talk about this bringing and taking, which actually are these deictic verbs that tell us where the person is located, I'm asking because there are some languages where it's pretty clear you must use one or the other based on where you are located. But then there are some languages, like in English, we can say bring and take wherever we are located. So these are important language differences, and I don't know which language was the original. Was it Danish? Yes. Was it Turkish? Because I think the defendant spoke no Arabic, only Danish and Turkish.
Exactly, yes.
So, yes, which language is the original?
It was in Danish, with clear variation from standard, I'd say. So we had multiple issues related to variation in gender, for instance, a bit word order, syntax that deviates from standard Danish and seem indicative of second language acquisition on both parts. But apparently the only shared language between them was Danish. Since he didn't speak Arabic and not even English. So Danish and Turkish were his 2 languages, and B's apparently don't cover Turkish, so Danish was there.
Were they both second language speakers of Danish?
Yes.
Okay, that's interesting. How is it in Danish in terms of bring and take? Is
right
it possible?
Now I'm trying to remember what the original verb was, and I can't, I'm sorry. But yes, we do have a difference, and so that's one of the things that I also try to bring out in my report, but I can't remember the exact word right now.
I'm just wondering about the time frame. What sort of conditions were you given for your work? Like, how much time did you have to do it, and also how much? You don't necessarily have to tell us in detail, but were you happy with what you were paid to do it? Because I know that's a bit of an issue as well. You might have a lot of other things to do.
Let me answer the last question first. I wasn't paid anything to do it. Having forensic linguistics in Denmark is very, very new. So I had met with some Danish police investigators on an occasion where I actually was able to bring one of the people who's not able to be here today, Robert Leonard, and we have tried to introduce them to forensic linguistics, and right after that one of them came up and said, okay, I may have a case that I'd like you to look at. And I had already mentioned to them that I won't charge you anything. I think at that point I had 2 objectives. One was to even begin doing this in Denmark, and another was the fact that I, to some extent, believe that as a government employee myself, there's no reason I shouldn't help for free. I can't do that for private clients, obviously, because then I will really take up too much of the time that I'm supposed to use as a university scholar and professor. But I wasn't paid anything to do that. And I was, given pretty ample time. I received the data in July, so over the holiday, and submitted a report in August. And they did not seem to be in a very big hurry. So I had about a month to do it, which is pretty good, I think. Much better than another case I had where I got the data 10 days before I was supposed to appear in court. So.
Hello. Thank you for that. Very interesting. Would you consider doing an analysis based on a translation, for instance, from Arabic into Danish?
No, I would not. I would ask someone who's proficient in Arabic to do that. There's just too many dangers. So if anybody wants to know the reasons, there's too many pitfalls in interpretation and translation. So there are just too many issues where the translation could have gone wrong, or in comparison to what the original meaning or intent was. And I have no way of checking that since I know no Arabic at all. I might be able to do an analysis in English because I'm fairly proficient in English myself. But I would consult with a native speaker if I did that. Yeah.
I don't want to cross-examine you, but did you consult with a Turkish specialist in Denmark?
No, I didn't, since there's no Turkish data in there, and I was not trying to bring out features that are indicative of which native language he had. He mentions that himself. So. Of course, there are some issues where you can say, okay, since they are both second language speakers of Danish, some of the interpretations may be at fault for that, or you can say maybe it's not as certain that here and there holds the meaning that they do for a standard speaker, but there's just nothing to show that they don't. Their uses of all the deictics or pronouns are consistent with the places that they mention. So, no, I didn't.
Tanya, perhaps I could also ask you a question.
Absolutely.
You just mentioned that you are introducing forensic linguistics in Denmark.
Mm-hmm.
What does the process look like?
I have been fortunate enough to have been able to present a very experienced expert witness, Robert Leonard, a few times, because I've had funding to fly him in, basically. So I've done that both to other academics and to the police. And I have some good contacts within the police, especially the police academy in Denmark, that I talk to. And through that, I sort of step by step try to present what we can and cannot do to different subgroups of Danish police. And also I try to get in touch with lawyers and attorneys that are not always very open to the fact that we might teach them something about language. It's quite difficult to get them to listen. But I try as much as I can, and I've also been fortunate enough to have been able to appear in the public media, which means that there is some public interest in it, and it's, as you probably already know, it's something that people care about and think is very interesting, and it's fairly easy to understand what it is that we do. So it's not some difficult linguistic theory, right? So we can do quite a lot with the applied version. So that's where it stands now. Yeah.
Wonderful. Any other questions or comments?
Thank you very much. It's so interesting. You said in the beginning that the police didn't give you, they didn't tell you what to look for, and you assumed that they were looking for intentions. Would you, at another occasion, ask the police, what do you want me to look for, or do you think it's a good idea that you just got a very open, analyze this?
Yes, I do actually think it was very good that I was not instructed to look at something or for something specific, because I think I would have been open to the exact same objection that I might have been biased then. Then I would try, we call it then confirmation bias, right? Trying to find anything that would point in the right direction, so to speak. So I'm actually glad that they were careful in that respect in not asking for something specific. Then I believe that one could, if they're given enough time, one could at a later stage perhaps ask them, is there something specific that you want me to focus on, or is there a question that you'd like me to work on in more detail? And then one could add that. But again, trying in the report to be very careful in specifying what is based on what type of information and what type of question, research question, in a sense.